It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Luke Schaefer. I'm faculty here at the University of Michigan in the School of Social Work and the Ford School of Public Policy. I'm also the director of a new university-wide interdisciplinary initiative called Poverty Solutions. It was an initiative that was started by President Schlissel, I think doing something that is truly unique, which is that setting as a university priority action-based research that can help build what we know about the best ways to prevent and alleviate poverty, working in partnership with community-based organizations and policymakers to test out strategies and make sure what we're doing in fighting poverty actually works and helps the people who we are working to serve. I came to this work, I'm a poverty scholar, and so most recently I finished a product that resulted in a book that I co-authored with Kathy Eden, who's now at Johns Hopkins University, called $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. And this book follows the lives of about half a dozen families in the United States that are surviving on very, very low levels of cash income in particular. And so these families aren't just poor by American standards, but are deeply, deeply poor. And the book was actually a bit of a departure for me from work I had done before. So in most of my work prior to this, I am a self-proclaimed data nerd. I love big spreadsheets and data. I love tables. Data makes me feel sort of warm and fuzzy inside, and I would cuddle it up at night if I could, but my wife doesn't let me. And Kathy Eden, my partner in crime on this book, she does something that's actually not all that common in the academy, which is when she wants to know about poverty in the United States, for 2 decades she's been going around and actually talking to people about their experiences. It sounds strange in the academy, although we have some great researchers here. My colleague Kristen Seefeld just published a book following a set of 45 families in Detroit called Abandoned Families, and it's all about how many families have been sort of left behind or left to fend on their own through systems of credit, systems of higher education, the welfare system, and low-wage work. So I would highly encourage you to check out her book. In the case of our book, Kathy and I were hanging out years ago, 2011, in her office, and we can both actually sort of remember the morning conversation where she said, "You know, Luke, I was a visiting fellow at the institution she was teaching at the time, and she said, you know, Luke, I'm seeing something that I haven't seen before. Here's someone who's been interviewing poor families in the United States for more than 2 decades and had written a number of and very influential books in the area. She said, you know, I'm seeing more and more families who aren't just poor by American standards, but are deeply, deeply poor, and in particular have a lack of an access to cash support. And we wondered if maybe this had something to do with the welfare reform of 1996, which ended a cash assistance program that was not well liked by policymakers and many of the families it served, but did provide a stable cash floor. In some of the cases, the families she was meeting had food stamps, but not by any means all of them. And a few had housing subsidies, but often families were housing assistance has actually become less and less common. It only serves about 1 in 4 of the families who are eligible, and there's incredibly long waits to get housing assistance now. And when we were doing our research, the wait to get any sort of public housing assistance in the city of Chicago was 85,000 families long. And the wait list was closed, so you couldn't actually be 85,001 if you wanted to. So we knew actually that that the safety net had actually been strengthened in some respects in the 1990s. We had a major expansion of a program called the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Eitc, sort of the most effective and worst named social program. When I say earned income tax credit, my students' eyes glaze over. And this is a program that provides a supplement to wages. So if you go out and work, then it will increase your wages. And different from most other programs, as your earnings go up, your EITC actually goes up till you hit about earnings that lift you out of poverty, and then it slowly starts to decline. So I think it's been a very successful program, but it's not a safety net, right? If we think of a safety net as something that catches you when you fall, the EITC doesn't do that. Because when your earnings fall to zero, your benefit falls to zero. So our questions were twofold. Had there been an increase in the number of families surviving at very low levels of cash income in particular? And if there had been, did it matter? If families often had access to benefits like SNAP, did that really sort of make up for what they were missing? And so I was the data guy, so I started to look around at all the different sources of data to say, do we have more families who are experiencing extreme poverty today than we did 15 years ago? I went to the best survey data that does the best job of capturing incomes of the poor, and it's not perfect by any measure. And I went to some administrative sources of data from when people apply for food stamps and they report under penalty of law what their income was. And if you get caught lying, it says on the application that it can be penalized with up to a $250,000 fine and 20 years in prison. So you're actually better off robbing a bank than you are lying on your food stamps application. Now, I don't actually think anybody's been penalized to that amount, but we're going to track back to this. This is one of the things I want to talk about, that when you apply for food stamps, that's what you're assigning, right? You are looking at something that says, we consider, fraud with welfare benefits to be so bad, we're going to penalize you worse than we would, if you rob a bank. So we started to look all of these sources of data, and no matter where we looked, we saw indications that the number of families surviving for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and even a year of incomes below $2 per person per day, we decided to riff off of the World Bank metric, had doubled, and in some of the sources of data actually looked like they had tripled or quadrupled to about 1.5 million families with 3 million children in 2011. And if you counted food stamps, you could see sort of the important impact that program was having. Like if we think of food stamps as cash, it cuts that number in about half. And maybe more if you look at the longer stretches of time. So this sort of led to the second question of, did it matter, right? And that's where we thought, that's not really sort of a question I can answer hanging out in my office looking at large-scale data, right? I can show you some tables that say, yeah, every source of data we have suggests that there is a serious problem at the very bottom of society in the United States. But I can't really tell you what the experience is, and I can't tell you if sort of other, some of these other things really make up for it. So that's when we departed from that work and spent a number of years visiting families in Chicago, Cleveland, Ohio. So Chicago we think of as the quintessential American city. We both did our graduate work there, so it was always nice to know where a good restaurant was after you spent a day, having to only, for one single day grapple with sort of the challenges that many of the families who we were meeting. Over to Cleveland, Ohio, which a lot like Detroit was an incredibly affluent city half a century ago. I mean, I don't think there's a comparison in the history of the world where in such a short period of time, cities like Detroit and Cleveland went from the very top, not just of America, but of the whole world, right? Detroit was one of the most affluent places in the world in the 1950s and is now easily, Cleveland and Detroit often rank as two of the poorest cities in the country. And in a number of metrics, right? If we get outside of income and we look at things like life expectancy and infant mortality, Detroit and Cleveland, I think, have markers that look much like places in the developing world. Down to Johnson City, Tennessee, the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, where we often think of the war on poverty as starting, and then down to the Mississippi Delta, a place that's been deeply poor for a very long time. And we got to know families, and what we learned was, rather than having families totally disconnected from society, the families we met in every place were actually very much connected to the labor market, saw themselves as workers often, but because of the perilousness of the jobs that were available to them and challenges in their family lives, these things would often interact in a toxic alchemy and send families spiraling down into a period of extreme poverty. And we learned that affordable housing is a tremendous challenge, right? We have millions of families who are, by every source of data we can find, are spending half of their incomes on housing, leaving too little for everything else. And with children, that often takes the form of doubling up, right? So children who are sort of precariously living with relatives, which can be a good thing in some cases, and as we found in our book, can often be a very, very bad thing, because you take families in crisis and they double up in a situation where they're powerless, and often this is where we would see trauma would happen, right? Because in the case of families at the very bottom, often the social networks that they have to rely on are at most unhelpful and at worst a big part of the problem. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was the part of these stories that I wasn't expecting, that I didn't go in thinking about at all. And that was, cash is important, right? We learned, as we met families, we saw how much of their lives were consumed trying to get just a little bit of cash to make to the next day, to pay the utility bill, to put the kids in decent clothes so that they could go to school, to maybe stay in the house one more month before they got evicted. And quite honestly, as a policy researcher, as I think about all the things we can do to tackle poverty, I would argue that the research base that we have suggests that the best intervention that we can do to support families is cash. Actually, every single one of our interventions, when we think about social workers, tutoring, mental health services, which all can have very positive effects, but in my mind, we should actually be gauging whether or not it would be just better to actually provide cash support to those families, right? That, I think, is sort of one of the markers of, are families better off with what we're doing than if we just gave them the money? And reverse of what a lot of the assumptions are, it turns out when you give families cash, and we have a number of sort of natural experiments in the research literature that find this, actually things like alcohol abuse go down, child outcomes improve, right? So rather than sort of squandering away resources, which happens in some cases, the overall average is that families are made better off, and not just a little, but by a lot. But what we saw that sort of beyond the importance of cash is the importance of dignity. And we saw sort of the experience of dignity to be a core foundational part of what it is to be a person. And so many of the families who we met, I think, so when I think of Susan Brown, who I'm going to talk to you about, and Ray McCormick, who I'm going to tell you about, so many of the families that we met, I think, would have gladly traded, the parents at least, going hungry for a day if they could be treated with respect for a day. They would take that trade. And as you get in, right, is when I'm sort of safely ensconced in my office a few blocks from here, looking at the data, we don't really have any good variables to tell us about the experience of poverty in a place like the United States, to the extent to which it is often about an experience of social isolation, of social exclusion, and a stripping away of dignity rather than enhancing it. So what Kathy and I want to argue, and I'm going to ask you to help me think about a little bit today, is that when we provide services for poor families, and I think we can think of this very broadly, when we're doing the incredibly important work of mentoring, of tutoring, of work in hospitals, right? I mean, I think we can think of this as not just a lesson for working with families who are struggling with poverty, but a lesson with working with any vulnerable or disadvantaged group. When we do that work, a key litmus test of whether or not we're doing it well or not is a question of whether or not what we're doing, not just the core of what we're doing, but in the practice of it, is it acting to enhance the dignity of the person we're working with, or is it acting to strip it away? So I just wanted to give you sort of 3 very quick stories that'll maybe illustrate a little bit about what I'm talking about. In the case of Ray McCormick, she is lives in Cleveland, Ohio, and her father died of cancer when she was 11, and her mother abandoned her, and she ended up living on her own, on and off, throughout the rest of her teenage years. When we met her, she was in her early 20s, and she had secured a job at a Walmart in Parma, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And she loved that Walmart job. She saw it as truly as a shelter from the storm outside, right? Of the storm of sort of her life, right? She was a low-wage job, and there was no way with the wages that she was being paid that she could afford a place of her own. So she was perpetually doubled up with Uncle George and Aunt Camilla or her ex-boyfriend, and sort of moving from place to place, right? And none of these environments were good environments for her and her daughter Azara. But at Walmart, right, at her job, she could put on her work uniform, clip on her name tag, and all of that sort of was outside, right? So she liked this job, and in fact, she was pretty good at it. She had this trick with the most common produce items, where she would read the barcode numbers of the produce items into a recording device in her phone, and then she would set it to play overnight and on repeat. So she'd say, in the morning, my subconscious had done the work, and she had memorized the barcodes for oranges, for apples, all of these commonly bought produce items, and she was named Cashier of the Month twice in the 6 months that she was in the job. But one day, right, she she's sharing a truck with her Uncle George, an unrelated uncle, and she gets in the truck to take it to work, and the gas light turns on. And she knows there's no way she's going to get to Parma without any gas in the truck. But she had given $50 to Uncle George to have gas so that she could take the truck to work. So she goes in and she says, "What's up? I paid the $50. He said, "Well, we were running errands. We used up all the gas." They get in this huge fight, and somehow he sort of blames it on her, right? Somehow this is her fault. And she is on such a razor-thin budget, right, with this $9 an hour Walmart job, that she doesn't have any other money. She's not going to have any other money for the next 2 weeks. And so Ray calls her manager at Walmart and says, can you float me a loan? Can you ask anyone else at the store, could they come pick me up? Can anybody give me a ride? Is there any way you can help me get to work? And her manager says, if you can't get in today, don't bother coming in again. We heard stories like that all over the place, right? Now, it's true that it's not Walmart's responsibility, right, to get her to work. But the experience of that, right, the experience of being, I think, thrown away, right? She's essentially been thrown away by her manager at Walmart after doing what she thought was a very good job at Walmart, right? and her fictive Ken, right? After everything she's experienced, she sort of relates to us that this felt in the moment like one of the worst things she'd ever experienced. And so she leaves living, she leaves this doubled up situation with Uncle George and Aunt Camilla and moves back in with her abusive ex-boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend that we know has pushed her down the stairs, has sort of thrown her to the ground, right? So she's literally someone who has no place to turn. A few months later, right after the book is ended, Ray texts me in my office just down the street from here and says, look, things are really bad. We don't have any food in the house. Can you help me sort of find out a place to get some food? And I say, you know what? I'm actually gonna stop what I'm doing, right? In this, this interesting relationship of like having gotten to know this person sort of in a deep way, in a meaningful way, but not having sort of the long-term connection, right? There are all these sort of challenges in the researcher, subject sort of relationship that don't transpose when you've sort of really gotten to know someone in the way that we gotten to know. But I say, I'm going to spend an hour and I'm going to find her food. I started by going to 211, right, which is a great service that helps you find out what are all the resources out there. And I called up a very reputable food bank in Cleveland as sort of the starting place. And I get on the phone, and it picks up, and an electronic voice says, "Your call will be answered in 10 minutes." And it plays sort of that annoying music in the background, right, that you all know. And I think, okay, this is great. I put it on speaker. I'm going back to running my regressions. And I'm thinking, 5 minutes goes by. Every once in a while it tells me, your call will be answered in 5 minutes. And I'm starting to think, geez, if I'm on a cell phone and I don't have a lot of minutes, this is really eating up. But it's okay, like they've told me when they're gonna help me. I know, they've told me in 5 minutes, I'm gonna get some help. And again, right, I'm not the person who's experiencing this. I'm just the guy like trying to help. So we get down to 2 minutes, 1 minute. Finally, it starts ringing, and it goes to voicemail. And I just about ripped my phone out of the socket and threw it against the wall, right? Because that feeling of, it felt like rejection, right? That here I was looking for help, right? And I'm not even the person experiencing this. And it's okay, I think, to send me to voicemail, but to make me sit for 10 minutes and waste my possible minutes, and then to say, we can't help you. I had a very visceral experience. So I called the next place, and another reputable place, and I'm not trying to sort of be down on these particular institutions, right? But I think this is just indicative of a larger picture. So I called another place, and in this time it went directly to voicemail, so that was an improvement. But they come on the line, the electronic, the answering service comes on the line and says, there are so many people who need help, we can't possibly return messages. So just keep trying until you get someone, right? So I've now been rejected twice. And then I called 3 or 4 other places, which were churches, right? And again, my wife's an Episcopal minister. I love the church. I love it when church does service. But I think in a lot of cases, right, it's all on volunteers. And we think of it as like an added thing that we're offering the families, doing well by them, right? But there often aren't standard hours or sort of any information about when I definitely can find someone. And on that particular day, I couldn't get anybody, right? So luckily, I actually had friends in Cleveland who I could ask to go, bring Ray some groceries, right? But Ray had no other option. She has no car, right? And in like the 2 hours that I spent calling places, I couldn't get a hold of a single person. So when you start to get into the literature, right, there's a great literature in psychology about social exclusion and social isolation. The experience of social rejection comes from this game called Cyberball, which we've repeated over and over again. And the setup is that somebody comes into the psych lab, and there's two people ostensibly waiting to also do a psych experiment, right? Probably a lot of undergraduates, right? But those two other people are actually work for the researchers, and they'll start throwing a ball back and forth to each other. And then they'll start throwing it to the real person who's there, the person who's there to actually do the experiment. And then after a while, all three are passing the ball. They'll start, the two researchers two people who work for the researcher will just start throwing it to each other again. They'll isolate that person. And then when we compare the people who had that experience to the people who weren't isolated, the results are quite astounding, actually. They've done the experiment where people are sort of hooked up to brain machines, and basically what we found out is the experience of social exclusion like that actually triggers the same brain response as physical pain. So being socially rejected, right, when Ray McCormick actually calls the food bank and can't get anyone, it is like she's being hit in a physical sense. The brain is experiencing it in the same way. And you can start to see, just with the small cyberball experiment, difference in perceptions, right? So people who have had the experience of social rejection like that then are more likely to interpret an ambiguous interaction as hostile or aggressive, right? So those experiences actually change the way that we interpret the world, right, in a very serious way. And these are just stupid psych experiments, right? So imagine Susan Brown is another one of the people in our book. In Susan Brown's case, when we met her, she had been applying for jobs on the iPhone touchscreen. She had applied for something like 40 or 50 jobs on an iPhone touchscreen in a month-long period by the time we met up with her. And a lot of these sort of big box, like when you apply for a job at a place like Walmart, I actually applied for a job at Walmart as part of the book. I didn't get a call, by the way. You have to take these personality assessments. It's worth doing. So some of them are like obvious things, like, I should or should not take office supplies home from work. I'm pretty sure no, right? But then there's like all these other ones that, like, I'm a PhD and I can't figure out. It's like, when there's not enough resources to, for two groups to finish their jobs, should you A, figure out a plan for how to deal with it, B, figure out a plan for dealing with it in the future, C, go talk to a supervisor. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do all three of those, right? But you have to pick one. In the case of Susan Brown, she'd done 40 or 50 of these. She was petrified of these tests, right? Because she's putting these applications out there time and time again and getting no response back. And there was one case where she finally got a job interview, and the Maps program on her phone, which, by the way, she got the phone for like $30 as a refurbished iPhone when she and her husband had a job. And it was her one connection with the outside world, right? You want to try sort of surviving in American society right now and getting a job, sort of becoming self-sufficient, the one resource you're going to give up at the very end is the phone, right? So in her case, she ended up walking exactly the wrong direction to the job interview, and she was super late. It was 20 blocks away. I think it was 10 or 12 blocks away. I think she ended up walking 20 blocks altogether, and she was late and sweaty for the job interview, right? And this was a job interview that, like, she'd done dozens upon dozens of applications before she had heard back. So we asked her. She and her husband and their 1-year-old was super cute. The three of them were doubled up in a house down in the deep south side of Chicago. The house literally was leaning to the left, right? And I think ready to fall down. They were surviving on their WIC, and I think they had some food stamps, although the amount that they were getting, I think, was maybe not quite right at the time. We asked her, have you thought about applying for cash welfare, right? Sort of the program that has become a sliver of its former self. And she said, I just think they're going to reject me, and I can't take another rejection. So, as we have started to think about where do we go next with our own work, we think a stable cash safety net is an important piece. We think fixing the low-wage labor market in a way that the families who want to work can succeed, right? So finding programs and ways to sort of raise the wages and also provide support to someone like Ray McCormick when she can't get to the job. We think all of those things are incredibly important, but we've also become just that much more curious about this issue of dignity, right? Applying for public benefits, in most cases, is an act of being stripped of your dignity. Incredibly intrusive questions, often sort of an assumption that you've done something wrong. And these are families who have nowhere else to turn, right? Most families will go to their extended family, they'll go to their friends, they'll do everything else before they get on benefits. And that's not universally true, right? Is one of the problems with systems like this is that there are people who cheat the system, just like there are people in any profession who cheat the system. But the typical person going into a welfare office feels like they have nowhere else to turn. So what if we flip that? What if we were able to, instead of stripping people's dignity, enhance it? I think one of the areas where we've been successful with that is the Earned Income Tax Credit, right? This poorly named thing. So this is a program that ostensibly does the same thing, actually, as our welfare program. It increases the incomes of poor families, but it's tied to work, and it's administered not through a public welfare benefits where you go in and you sit in a waiting room and you look at posters about how you need to figure out how to become self-sufficient in your life, right? You get your Earned Income Tax Credit through the same way, probably the most universally American experience, which is paying your taxes. We simply, do the Earned Income Tax Credit through the tax code. And so this is a program that delivers aid, right? It's inside American values. It's not perfect in my mind because it's not a cash safety net. It doesn't catch people at the very bottom. It doesn't catch them when they fall. We can't use the word safety net for it, but it provides aid to struggling families in a way that folds them into society. And there's this really interesting mystery of why most people prefer to go to a place like H&R Block and pay $200 to get their taxes done versus going to a Vista site. Do we have any Vista volunteers? Anybody, or maybe Vita? All right, we got one, right? How that help people pay help people file their taxes for free. My good friend Bob Mull, who actually is the first one to introduce me to the Rotary Club here in Ann Arbor. I think this is like his life passion is doing people's taxes and getting it right. And I really admire him for that. When we look at why people move to sort of route towards H&R Block most of the time, one of the obvious reasons is that you can get your refund quicker, right, through one of these sort of short-term loans. But that's not actually, as far as we can see with the evidence, the primary reason. The primary reason is when you go in to file your taxes at a place like H&R Block, anybody know the slogan of H&R Block, or at least what it was a few years ago? You've got people. You've got people. We've got your back. And if we're right about the rest of these experiences, right? Think about somebody who's constantly calling up the food bank and can't get anyone on the phone, right? That is a very appealing message. And it's very appealing to be treated with respect, to be treated as a customer, right, when you come in. And that's just a lot for Vita sites to compete with, right? Vita sites, we have these incredibly dedicated volunteers, and my guess is that they're actually better at filing taxes in a lot of cases than when you get your taxes done at H&R Block. But that's an empirical question that we can figure out. It looks more like the experience of going to the food bank, right? So it looks more like I'm getting sort of free aid versus I'm being folded into American society. And we can't change that completely, right? But I think the question going forward is, in the work that we do, from the very top level to the very specific details of that work, how does what we do enhance dignity, and how does it strip it away? So what I'm hoping maybe we could do for a few minutes. So how many people in the room have experience mentoring, doing taxes, volunteering at a food bank? Can I just see hands? Okay, great. What I'd like to do is they're going to bring the lights up a little bit for me, I think, so I can actually see you. But I'd just like to talk about two questions. I have three questions for you. One, what are some experiences looking back that inadvertently, maybe without seeing, sort of some environment you were in was acting in some small way or some large way to strip people of their dignity? Do we have any examples of that? So I'll ask you that, and then I'll ask you about what it is in the work that you've done that you thought was really dignity enhancing, right? That really left people feeling, the people that we serve, feeling like they were being folded into society rather than being set apart. And then the final question is, wherever you are, right? If you think back about your experiences, think back about being in the feeding program, maybe down at St. Andrews if you're from around here, the backdoor food pantry, I think is a great example. Both of these are great examples in town of programs that deliver services with dignity. But we can always do better, right? What about in our own lives? As we think about living in an incredibly isolated society, right? Where here I live in Ann Arbor, it feels like I can go days without seeing a family living in deep poverty. And some of that's true because of the physical, geographical isolation of those with means and those without. But also part of it's true in that the way that we can actually often live in the same places in not the same spaces, right? So the reality of my life is I probably walk by people like Susan Brown on a weekly basis, but remaining hidden is sort of a coping mechanism, right? It's a strategy for survival, so I just don't know it. Or, because of my privilege, I didn't notice. So these are your three questions. One, what's an experience where you thought, we could do better in enhancing dignity, where we were maybe acting to sort of signal people out or not necessarily you, but sort of the environment you were in. Two, what's a sort of a good example of being dignity enhancing? And three, what's one tangible way that we can move forward and do better from wherever we're starting from? So you have a minute to think about it while I get the handheld mic, and they give me a little bit more light, hopefully, and I come down. They told me I had to use the stairs, so I'm going to disappear and come right back. Ta-da! Hey. Okay, so who are my brave souls who will give me any thoughts? Go ahead, Barbara.
So I guess I guess I have an example for the first one. So our Rotary Club, I'm in Naperville, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, and we used to do a program called PADS, which is like a homeless shelter in a church. And it always seemed very strange. We don't do this program anymore. And it always seemed very strange because we, as Rotarians and the volunteers, would be standing in the kitchen. And it was kind of like, it's natural to stand in the kitchen and serve food, but we never went on the other side of the counter and interacted. And that always kind of struck me as like, oh, it just didn't seem right. So that was maybe my example of that. But I think I have a really cool example of a friend also in Chicago. She started an organization called Just Embrace. And she creates dinner parties and activities that breaks down barriers that marginalize people. And she invited, and she lives in a poor neighborhood in Chicago, and she creates these dinner parties, and she invited my husband and I to the dinner party, and I know her from church, and other people to the dinner party, and she makes the dinner. But the other people at the dinner party are people that we would never interact with. They're the people that are the homeless people in the neighborhood, and so we're eating. It was really cool because we weren't serving them dinner and marginalizing them or making them feel less than. We were eating dinner at the same dinner table, and it's a really cool thing that she does. And then, do I have to answer the other one?
No.
Okay.
If you don't want.
Yeah.
Okay, Barbara. So I feel like that answer was so perfect that it would look like I paid Barbara, but I want the record to show that I did not pay Barbara, right? So we've got, and we can talk about if you have experiences that are the same or, feel free, like we can have some of this, but we have two sort of action items, right? One, when you go to a food pantry or a feeding program, get out from the other side of the table. Actually interact with people. And I got to tell you, right, I find that just a little bit scary. It's hard for me to do at the start, but we have to, and I think we'll be better for it. And two, on the positive side, are programs that actually bring people from our disparate parts of society together in ways that are equal footing. Excellent. All right.
I was working for social services at the time, many years ago, and making one of these home calls. The first one I ever made was so difficult because I just couldn't understand how, on what basis, I had the right to go into somebody else's home, but that was the job. So this one particular day, and I got the job because my caseworker, I was on Eitc for the last year of my college. They don't let you do that anymore. And so I got a bachelor's degree, and she said, you could qualify for this job. So that's how I got it. I got from one side of the counter to the other. So I'm at this client's home, and her little boy starts doing something that my little boy was doing. And I had no idea how to handle it, so I just asked her. Well, all of a sudden, she was the expert. She was the person who was giving, not being the recipient. And that was so cool. What a wonderful thing for me to learn at such a young age.
Wow, these are great examples. Ready, Ellen?
Hi, my name's Ellen Young, and I'm from the Chicago area too, but our Rotary Club has tried to give out coats. We're very strong into Operation Warm. And it's an observation when you said go to the other side of the table. I have had the experience of being able to distribute coats at a daycare center, and that's really cool because you're trying on these coats with these kids, and it's all a real feel-good moment for you. And then in my new Rotary Club, I haven't been able to have that experience because the daycare center felt that they didn't want to demean their kids by having the wealthy people who bought the coats give the coats to the kids. So we didn't actually get to try on the coats. So obviously our experience was diminished in some respect, and that's okay, because we're not the ones that need the experience. The kids need the coats. But I think it raises an issue of how we do this, and I'm glad you raised it, because it made me think of that experience.
Yeah, I think this is a terrific example of, I think these things have to be a conversation. It's not between just us and the people we serve, but about us and the intermediaries by which we serve them. And it's important to remember, when somebody's reacting, when somebody's having that experience, it's not, in this case, it's not about Ellen, right? They don't know Ellen. It's about something else that happened. My hunch is there was some experience in the past, right? So maybe there's an opportunity to do relationship building over time to sort of get past some of those hurdles as time goes on.
Hi, I'm Marga Hugo from the Rotary Club of Chicago. And I think that through Rotary, we have all had the experience of putting in practice a lot of the theories on peace building. Probably one of the most important lessons I learned is that dignity does not discriminate. We all have the same dignity, whether we are the president of the world or just a homeless person. What I have learned, there was a series of events that ended up me traveling by myself to West Africa to follow up on a global grant we were working on. And I was there by myself for 1 week, no other Rotarians with whom to bounce ideas. But I found myself totally immersed in the community we were working with. And I thought the most valuable thing I could do with them was to listen and to try to immerse myself in the way their timing worked for getting things done. And it was very enriching because we could come to a successful conclusion of this grant, but they were leading. It was not us coming and telling them, this is the best, most efficient way you can do it, because our way may not work. And I think that when you go to a place like what you did in the soup kitchen, is just to listen to people, go on the other side, and follow their lead many times. And I think that's very humbling. And again, like I said, dignity does not discriminate. We all have the same. We all want the same.
So listening in a non-judgmental, open way, and sort of understanding that often when we do these service projects, which are important work, that it's not just a service project that we're doing, but an experience of social connection, right?
Hi, my name's Alexandra. I'm actually a member of the Dexter Rotary Club. So when you were talking about stripping dignity, the first thing that came to me actually is also work in a homeless shelter. And in that case, though, I was thinking more about just the situation itself. Maybe not some person doing it, but just the fact that these people work with families in an Alpha House homeless shelter. These people reach the lowest point in their life. It's just set up for families. It's just very difficult, just the whole situation. There's a waiting list. I'm sure they went through difficulties just to get into that homeless shelter. So just, I guess the idea that situations can strip dignity. But one thing that happened, this is probably a good 15 years ago, one of the people living in the homeless shelter decided they wanted to pass the GED. They had gone through, I think, they had almost graduated from high school, very close. But they decided they had always wanted to go back to high school. They didn't want to get a GED, but now she was in her mid-20s and realized she probably wasn't going to go back and actually get the degree. So she wanted to get her GED. Many other women in that homeless shelter at the same time decided they wanted to do that too. So a group of us got together. We tutored these women. There were like 7 or 8 women. They all passed. And just the idea that these doors were now open to these women. They now were dreaming of going to college, things they had never thought about doing before. And the idea, too, that now they could apply for a job, right? Now they had a GED. So it just opened all these doors. And they started this themselves, too. So it was really, yes. It was a wonderful experience.
All right, I'm going to come to the back of the house a little bit here. I think we had a, here we go, here, and we'll just go down the line.
I'm Carol Stradling from Monticello, Indiana, a town of about 5,000 residents. And this is not a Rotary project, but my local church, the Monticello United Methodist Church, fed the community during the tornado of 1974. They've been feeding people since then, but started a Thanksgiving community meal about 2000, so about 16 years ago. And when it started, it was a community meal. Elderly people who didn't have family around, or if you were alone for Thanksgiving, come, join, eat together. And the tables were different, and it was really it was a social event. And we still have the community Thanksgiving meal, but now it's mostly there are those people who are doing the cooking and doing the services, and then there are those that are receiving. They're more needy now. And I'm noticing that there are a lot more carry-out delivery meals. People are not coming in to partake of that. They are asking that food to be delivered. So the feeding is still going on, but it's not the social event that it started out to be.
I think this is a really terrific example where in social work we call it sort of self-reflective practice, right? That wherever we are, things can change, and it's easy to sort of not see. So this sort of work of saying, I really like the way we did this before. It seems to be morphine, and I don't think that's anyone's fault, but is there a way that we can sort of get back to some of the roots of what this was about at the start?
Hi, I'm Ranjan Kini. I'm from Rotary Club of Schererville, Indiana. This is nothing to do with the Rotary project. You talked about dignity. In my professional life, I'm a professor. As I walk through every day, I see the custodian waving at us. And that custodian also walks by when we have a conversation with the students who come to my office and talk to him. He would stand over there, look at me, and walk away. So one day I said, hey, come on in, sit down, let's talk. What did you want to ask about? So we had a general conversation. First of all, he said, no, I don't want to sit down. And I said, no, you can sit down just like other students, and let's talk. We had a conversation, and first of all, he was surprised that I asked him to sit down when students were supposed to sit down. Over a period of time, this is about 2-3 years now, he is a brilliant poet, and he slides poetry under my door. And we started publishing that in our departmental letterhead and then university letterhead. That changed the way he has an outlook in the university. So you talked about dignity. It just took for me to bring him to the office and make him sit down and talk to me about what his interests are. So the dignity point is an important one.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of the positive side of this, is that you took action and asked them to sit down. The negative side maybe is, like all too often, that doesn't happen, right? And that what we see is a custodian that's sort of like almost like part of the scenery, if you will, right? And underneath was a poet. That's amazing.
I'm with the Detroit AM Rotary, and I currently actually work at the U as a case manager, but prior to that I worked at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit with the population you're talking about. And I had a gal, and she kind of worked the streets, and somebody beat her upside the head with a baseball bat, and so she was in the hospital. Well, when she started to get better, I said, well, where are you going to live? What are you going to do? She said, I'm just going to go back to what I was doing. I said, you know what? You are a charming gal. We would talk all the time. I said, you know what? I'm going to send you to Michigan Rehab Services, and I think you could get a job. They can train you to get into a job. And I said, why don't you use your little bit of money and go to an AFC home? At least that'll give you some people to socialize with. Then I went down, of course, in the emergency room, they cut off all your clothes when you come in a mess, so you don't have any clothes to wear out. And so I went down to the clothing closet, and I got her a wardrobe. And when she came out of the room and the staff looked at her, she was stunning. And the staff, they didn't know it was her. She was so proud of herself. She followed through on everything. She never came back to the hospital. And it's all about dignity and hope and having respect for people. And it's worked with a lot of other patients there too, but she was my favorite because she was funny. She was a great gal.
My name is Alex Bernardo. I've done work with a program in Pennsylvania, Young People Who Care. This is in the Appalachia, which is a very poverty-stricken area. We help people with poverty of monetary, physical. You're 85 years old and you can't push a lawnmower to mow your grass. Have people help you with that, or as well as mental. Some of the kids that come over to some of the houses, those kids that visit, every summer are the only family that these people may have. They don't have any other parents or any other children. And one of the things about dignity is that when they call the center, first they exchange names, and the first question that the person that we're helping is asked is, how can we help? What is your need? This is the first thing that we ask them in identifying whatever that they may need help with to put them at ease. Then we have also a bunch of other things, such as what clothing we can wear, how we can take pictures, and all about the dignity with the people that we work with.
Great. So starting from where the people are, and so all too often, I know I only have 2 minutes. I'm going to get one more here in the back. All too often, we prescribe, right, when we're working with poor families, we prescribe what they need and what we should be giving them. And we can't always totally flip that around, but the extent to which we can in every case is great. Let's see, do you mind coming to me a little bit?
My name's Nico Brown, and I'm coming from Toledo. I'm not old enough to be in a Rotary Club. I'm coming from Young Men of Excellence. And when you're talking about getting on the other side of the table, I understand where you came from with that. And back in Toledo, we had a project in our Seagate Center, the Noel Project, and we was able to give these kids that didn't have a chance to have Christmas, we was able to give them out turkeys for their dinner, winter coats, bikes, and toys, because their parents had to pay, usually it was a single mother who had to take care of like 2 or 3 kids, so they had to pay all their bills for heat so they could survive. So when you say get on this other side of the table, it really spoke out to me and made me think of this experience. So.
Thank you. We got, I'm sorry. I'm going to take, okay, I'm so sorry I talked for so long because this was amazing. So thank you for all your work. Continue to be conscious of the things that we can do better, right? Let's have continuous improvement. And, I think that the people we serve will be better for it, and so will we. Thank you.
Thank you.